Good day to you. In this module, we're going to build on our discussion of stress and strain and the measurement of the Young's modulus, this fundamental property of materials, biological and otherwise, that relate stress and strain to one another. Now, the Young's modulus is an interesting thing to begin with, but it has lots of practical applications, lots of fun applications as well. And what I'd like to do here is to go through some of the ways that you can use the Young's modulus to learn some interesting things and learn some interesting ways of describing how biological materials work in actual living systems. Okay, the first fun thing that we're going to look at is the way that you can use the stress-strain curve to measure a quantity known as the work of extension. Now, we've mentioned that before in another module, that if you take an elastic material and you deform it, you're going to end up, that's going to imply that there's a certain force operating on that object. And so we can take a very, very simple object here. This is a pen on a rubber band, and obviously if I put more force on it, we're going to deform that rubber band. It's going to go down, 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 and so forth. All right. Now, for me to be able to do this, I had to put work into this system. I had to use my muscles to pull down this pen, and that has generated a force at my hand, and that is what keeps this down. Now, when I have done this, I have done work on this system. I've done work on this rubber band, and we can use the Young's modulus to actually estimate what that is. Let's come over here to a graph, again, of strain versus stress, dimensionless, units of pressure. And let's say that we're dealing with a nice, well-behaved material that has a constant Young's modulus along the degree of strain that we have imposed upon it. Now, if we take a length at resting and we then measure the stress and strain at the strained length, then obviously as we move this down, there's going to be a constant relationship between stress and strain. But the work that we have done on this can actually be measured by the area under our stress-strain curve. And so this area over here is called the work of extension. Now this presents a very, very interesting property of elastic materials, and this will become relevant when we delve into the aspects of locomotion. Namely, when I take this device and I do work on this elastic system and I pull it down, this is a store of potential energy that can be tapped to be able to do work. And so by principles of conservation of energy, I do work on the system. There's energy in there to be stored, and just to make sure nothing gets damaged here, if I release it, then work can be done to actually accelerate that device and do work on it. And so one of the things that you can do with the stress-strain curve is to actually quantify what the amount of energy is that you've stored in something, and therefore enable you to quantify how much work can be tapped to do, how much energy can be stored to do work later. Now, obviously, when you're looking at different kinds of materials, then certain kinds of materials are good stores of energy compared to other kinds of materials. And specifically, we can come along to our stress-strain curve over here, epsilon versus sigma, okay? And if we deform one kind of a substance, let's call it a sea anemone, for example, that's going to have a small Young's modulus of elasticity. And we compare this with the amount of energy that we can store in, say, a tendon. We saw that the tendon has a much larger modulus of elasticity than does the sea anemone. Then if we deform both of those by a certain amount, from L0 to L, then clearly the squishy anemone is going to store less energy for us than will the much more elastic tendon. And therefore, if we're looking to some kind of an object as a storehouse of potential energy that we put into it, then clearly we want something that has the highest modulus of elasticity as possible. Now, in the case of this kind of relationship here, this has been put to interesting use throughout history, most notably by the Romans. The Romans, of course, were very aggressive. They had a very expansive empire, and when they encountered cities that didn't really want to come under Roman rule, they had to somehow conquer them. And of course, one of the classic things in Roman and Greek literature, for that matter, is the siege of a walled city. And the Romans were very ingenious at figuring out how to use, how to build the devices that can actually break down the defenses. And one of the interesting devices was a device called a ballista, B-A-L-L-I-S-T-A. You can do some Google search on this and look for ballistas, and there are all kinds of fun videos operating there. You can find on YouTube and places like that. And the ballista was kind of an ingenious device. It consisted of two big plates that were separated from one another by posts, by columns. And in between these two platforms, they took large tendons and they coiled them up, separating the top plate from the bottom plate. And what they did then was they took large beams of wood and they strung them through here, through these kinks in these coils of tendon. And these were attached, of course, to a little basket in which you can put a big rock. And what the Romans did to be able to operate this ballista is that they had levers and winches that could actually move these arms inward, and when they released them, the arms would spring back outward, flinging the rock towards the wall. And the idea there, of course, was to break down the wall. And these were very, very effective devices. They could fling 100-pound rocks over several hundred meters or so, and in this way they could actually break down quite nicely the defenses against buildings. And again, we can't be flinging around rocks in this studio, but we can illustrate the concept of a ballista just by taking a pen here and holding it up like so, and obviously we can get that spinning, doing work on that. And the Romans, of course, chose tendon because they knew, not so much scientifically, but through experience, that the amount of energy that they could store in a ballista was very large when they used tendons as opposed to ropes or other kinds of materials. Okay, so the ability of elastic materials to store energy to do work is correlated quite directly to the Young's modulus of elasticity. Okay, now let's take a look at some other things, interesting things that we can do here. One thing that you can look at here, especially with the stress-strain curve, is to examine a quantity known as the work of fracture. Now, in natural selection as well as in engineering, a very important thing to know and a very important determiner of design is how much stress you can put into an object, how much strain it can bear before it falls apart and breaks. And the stress-strain curve, enables us to actually estimate what the work of fracture is. And it's a quite simple process, intuitively obvious. If you take an unstrained material and you put sufficient strain on it, eventually that material is going to fail. It's going to break apart which will indicate with a little star there. And of course, when it breaks apart, it's no longer bearing a load. That is, it's no longer carrying a stress, and this will basically fall back down to zero. All right, now just as you can use the area under the stress-strain curve to estimate the amount of energy that's stored in an elastic deformation, you can also use it to estimate how much work you have to do on something to get it to fail. So if you start with an unstrained length over here and you move up to the strain at which it fails, then you'll end up with an area under this curve right here, and the area under the curve is the so-called work of fracture. Now, the work of fracture is kind of an interesting thing to know. And again, there are lots of different kinds of measurements of these things. Let's put up some measurements here for us. And if we look at the work of fracture and we compare different kinds of materials, let's start again with steel. Steel has a work of fracture anywhere from 10 to the 5th to 10 to the 6th joules per meter cubed, and that is the typical way that work of fracture is designated as an energy density, basically. Now, if we look at different kinds of biological materials, we see some interesting patterns. First of all, if we look at teeth, let's take a look at teeth first. You'll remember that the modulus of elasticity of teeth was really quite large, and of course the question might arise if the modulus of elasticity, Young's modulus, is an indicator of how much energy you can store in a material. Why is it that the Romans went to tendons rather than teeth? And the answer here is in the work of fracture. Teeth are very, very tough. They're very stiff, but they tend to fail quite easily. And anyone who's been hit in the mouth with a rock or something has experienced this quite directly. If you look at the work of failure of teeth, you find it's quite a bit smaller. It's about 200 joules per meter cubed. So even though teeth are very, very tough, very strong, very stiff, nevertheless they're fairly weak. They can fracture quite easily. You don't have to do a lot of work on them to get them to fall apart. If you look at bone, again the same question arises. If tendon is so good but bone is stiffer, why is it that tendon was the natural choice? Well, again, the answer to this lies in the work of fracture that has to be done. Bone is obviously much more resilient than, or I should say tougher than teeth are. You're talking about a work of fracture that's about an order of magnitude larger than that for teeth. But again, bone is much stiffer than tendons, and again, why did the Romans choose tendons rather than bones? And we see here that when we look at tendon, here's the answer for us. You're looking at a work of fracture of about 20,000 joules per meter cubed there. All right, and so that's another one of the interesting things that you can do with the stress-strain curve. A third thing is that so far we've been looking at fairly well-behaved materials, that is, materials that have a stress-strain curve in which the relationship between strain and stress is a nice linear relationship, okay? Constant Young's modulus throughout the range of the material, range of strain that the material will experience. If you look at most biological materials, on the other hand, you find that they actually are not so well behaved. You typically have a stress-strain curve in a natural material, a biological material, that looks something like this. That is, at low degrees of strain, it's a fairly compliant tissue, but at high degrees of strain, it gets to be very, very stiff. And there's lots of reasons for this. You can have mixing of different kinds of materials, such as collagen or elastin, relatively stiff versus relatively elastic materials. Another reason is that when you strain biological materials, what you're usually doing is you're straightening out little kinks in the collagen fibers or the fibrous proteins that give a material its strength. If you look at the way that these things are oriented at the microscopic level, they form complicated meshes, and when you pull on them, they tend to straighten out. And during that period where it tends to straighten out, the stress-strain curve can be fairly shallow. It's a fairly compliant material over that, but when it gets stiff like that, when all the kinks are worked out, it tends to get very, very stiff. And when that happens, then you get into this range where you have a very stiff material. Okay, so one of the interesting things that you can do with this stress-strain curve is that you can quantify how it is that the mechanical properties of the structure, be it tendon or bone or whatever, how those things interact with the typical kinds of strains and stresses that are imposed upon them in nature. And when you do that, you get into some very interesting issues of biological design and how is it that organisms become designed in particular ways. Okay, another thing that you can do with the stress-strain curve is that you can measure the efficiency of an object at being an engine for storing potential energy under elastic deformation. And again, let's take our stress-strain curve over here, and let's look at what happens when we stretch the material and what happens when we let it go. So here is our stress-strain curve when we stretch a material. We move it from its unstrained value over here up to its strained value over here, okay? And we're going to pretend it doesn't matter what shape this is, but we're just going to pretend that it's a non-linear relationship between stress and strain. That is, the Young's modulus is not constant throughout the deformation. And as we move up this curve, we're going to be doing a certain amount of work on that system. And that is going to correspond to a work of extension. That is, this is the storage of energy in this system. If we then release it and allow it to release its energy, we might get a curve that looks something like this. And this is what happens when you're releasing it. This is the work that you put in red. In green, this is the work you get out. Now, most materials, and this includes things like steel, but also especially biological materials, they often have this kind of dissociation between the stress-strain curve during extension and the stress-strain curve during the release of the tension. This phenomenon, that is, this disparity, is known as hysteresis. And hysteresis is important because it enables us to gauge what the efficiency of this system is. And let's see how to do that. If you measure the area under the curve during the release of energy, then you're going to calculate a work value, just as you did when we measured the area under the curve in red over here. And that area is going to be the work released. Now, there's going to be a difference between the two, and that's going to be the red area minus the green area. And this is going to be energy lost, and it's going to come out as heat. And so the efficiency of an object as a store of potential energy is determined by the difference between the work put in during extension and the work that is released during the release of it. And the difference is going to be heat. And you can demonstrate this to yourself quite nicely. Rubber is one of these substances, and here's a rubber band. And if you move this back and forth like this, as you put energy in, you're putting a certain amount of energy in. As you release it, you're getting a certain amount of energy out. But when you put a quantity of energy in, you're not going to get the same amount of energy out. And the difference is going to end up heating up this rubber band. And so if you move a rubber band back and forth like this, and you put it against your skin, you'll feel that the rubber band gets somewhat warm. And the warmth that you're feeling is this heat that's being released here. Okay, and this quantity right here, that is the efficiency of these systems to be able to recover energy, has a special name. It's known as resilience. And if we look at the different kinds of biological materials out there that have resilience, let's put some some values up here. Steel, of course, is a very resistant material. You're talking about resiliences up to 99 to 100% at certain strains, mostly towards 100% range, because steel is almost a perfectly elastic substance. Not quite, but close. If you look at the principal material that makes up tendons, that is collagen, then you find that collagen is a very resilient material. That is, it has a resilience on the order of about 93% or so. If you compare that with certain kinds of elastic materials, for example, and invertebrates, the principal elastic fiber that exists there is known as elastin. You're looking here at resiliences of about 76%. So even though elastin is more elastic, less stiff than collagen, and can store more energy, nevertheless it's not quite as resilient. There's quite a bit of heat that's lost during extension and release. Silk is a surprising substance. You'd expect silk to be quite strong because we keep hearing things about how strong silk is, but if you look at the resilience of silk, it's actually quite poor. It's about 35% or so. And this reflects the fact that silk is actually kind of a liquid crystal. It deforms very easily under strain. And then finally, there's an invertebrate elastic material that's more or less equivalent in function to elastin, but the remarkable thing about that is that it has a very, very high resilience. It has a resilience on the order of about 97%. So the ability of an organism to be able to recover stored energy from resilin is much, much greater than it is in collagen or in elastin. Now there's an interesting application of this that we can talk about, and this is related to fleas. And here's a little flea right there, okay? And the flea has legs that the flea has to contract and change shape or change position quite quickly to get it to be able to jump up. And the interesting thing about fleas is that they're so small that their muscles themselves cannot power the jump of a flea. So what the flea does is it has a little pad, a little stop on its exoskeleton. It has a little pad of resilin right there. And the flea uses its muscles to pull this leg up. And the muscles act fairly slowly, not quickly enough to power the jump of the flea themselves. But what the muscles do is that they very slowly press the leg up against the resilin pad. And as they put it up against the resilin pad, it stores energy in there, and there's a little catch mechanism, and when the flea is ready to jump, it simply releases the catch, and then all the stored energy in the resilin can be released all at once, much faster than the muscle can release it. And when that happens, you get a very strong impulse of force directed through the flea's legs against the ground, and the flea can then jump up to quite a high value. But it can't do it with its muscles alone. It requires the storage of potential energy in this pad of very resilient resilin. Okay, well that's all for today, and we will see you another time. Good day.